Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 10, Episode number 8. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
On this episode, we're taking a deep dive into retail stores, a topic, of course, we visit often, but our focus is what should we make of the numbers we're seeing for 2025 store closures versus openings, some very big movements, and with the help of some data from Coresight, we want to peel that particular onion back, get past the tears, and provide our perspective about what all this means. Steve, we talked about this as a theme at some point that we were going to have in Season 10 in 2025. You touched on your predictions, but now feels like the right time to have this conversation early on.
Yeah, as you pointed out, it is one of my predictions that retail store closures are going to accelerate. But as well, I guess touch on briefly in the news, we are seeing a real escalation. I think store closures year to date in the U.S. anyway are already up 400% year over year.
Big numbers.
And last year was the highest year for store closures in several years. So there's this, are we going through a retail apocalypse? Physical retail really challenged in a different way than perhaps it's been talked about over the last few years. So let's dive into that in just a few minutes.
Now, breaking news, it's March. Can you believe it? Like, it's already March. And
it is March.
And when I think of March, of course, my mind turns to Shop Talk in Las Vegas. Great conference. And we'll be there. We look forward to seeing.
I thought you were going to say college basketball. No?
Well, no. Shop Talk first, basketball second, or eighth in my case. But anyway, you are going to be on stage, and you've been teasing who would be joining you on the stage, but I think you got some details now. So share with me and the people, because I just found out myself.
Sure. Well, before I get to that, on the day this episode drops, we are 3 days. We are 3 weeks away from Shop Talk kicking off in Las Vegas, and we do have a discount for our listeners if you want to register, which you absolutely should. So look for that in the show notes. But yes, my session will be on the Wednesday. So that's March 26th, day 2. And the title of it is Pivots, Making Bold Changes with Agility and Flexibility. So we've touched on some of these topics certainly before on the pod, and I get into that quite a bit in Leaders Leap, as readers will know. But so this particular session will be in what's called the talk show format, which is I will be interviewing 3 guests, but they will be in succession, not all at once. So the 3 guests will be Lockie Andrews, who actually was on the podcast like 3 years ago. I think at this point, she's the CEO and founder of Rich Hair Care Americas. Second guest, Tarek Mueller, who is the co-founder and co-CEO of About You. The last guest will be Matt Navarro, who is president of Stanley 1913, a.k.a. the Big Ass Cups Company. So 3 really interesting perspectives. And so, I'll be unpacking what led them to their particular strategies, how do they build flexibility and agility into their business model, which I think will actually tie pretty nicely into one of the first news topics. So I hope to see you in Las Vegas in just a few weeks.
All right, well, let's get to the news. And it is brought to you by our friends at Celonis, enabling process intelligence to make business processes work across systems, departments, and organizations. Try it for free at celonis.com. That's CELONIS.com. You know, Steve, in prior seasons, certainly in season 8 and 9, probably in prior seasons, we'd start this segment off with a look at like kind of macro news developments, right? We kind of provide a bit of a framework for the news. Now, it feels like season 10 will be about the chaos of the week so far anyway. So
unfortunately,
we wanted to talk about this in the context. I've had a lot of discussions with business leaders in the past couple of weeks, and it's just the environment of which we are operating in. So talk about what you're observing. I mean, there's lots of news. Some people would be familiar mostly with the news, but talk about the operating environment and how you and other retailers you've been talking to are just thinking about this time that we're in right now.
Yeah, like you, I've had several conversations with retail leaders, people around the retail ecosystem in real estate, et cetera, during this past week. And as much as this is a very negative take, there's 3 words that keep coming back: chaos, uncertainty, and stupidity. And maybe just touch quickly on each of them. I think the chaos is probably obvious. A lot of it is very much tied to the political climate here in the U.S., but of course that has ripple effects. So what's happening with tariffs the day this episode goes live? Supposedly the tariffs for Mexico and Canada will be in force. Guess we'll see if that actually happens or how long they stick. Trump this past week pretty much signaled he was looking to put tariffs on the EU. That's not new as a possibility, but seemed a bit more convicted as he met with the UK Premier Macron and some others. So, but we don't know. And that really gets to the second part, which is uncertainty. And I'll be curious on your take on this as well. A couple of conversations I've had with, including president of one retailer, said, we don't like the tariffs. We don't like that there might be these massive spending cuts or these things that could have a big, could keep inflation high, could keep interest rates elevated, could be a drag on consumer spending. We don't like that. But what's worse is we don't know what's going to happen. And so if you don't know whether tariffs are going to stick, or are they 25%, maybe they're 10%, are they on everything, or maybe they're just on steel, not knowing that causes, best case scenario, paralysis. I said to somebody yesterday, I said, I bet, if anybody asked me, I would say to just about any retail CEO, unless it's an absolute slam dunk, I wouldn't sign a store lease. I wouldn't commit to a new capital project. I'd probably have a hiring freeze. Because you just don't know what's going to happen. And many of the things that can happen are demonstrably negative for the economy, at least in the short term. So uncertainty is one thing that causes paralysis, but it also can cause a lot of churn because you're having to go through all these scenarios. Maybe you're moving inventory in and out of places. It raises costs, it raises stress, and it just creates a lot activity that is very, very unnecessary. Which brings me to the last point, which is stupidity, because this doesn't make any sense. There's a lot of good reasons, at least just coming from the U.S. perspective. Sure, there's reasons to have more government efficiency. Sure, it's very important that we deal with the debt. Yes, there are opportunities for better cross-trade policies. I mean, all of that is true, but the way we're doing about it is about as bad a way as you could possibly do it. So something needs to happen here. And I bring this up because I'm just increasingly worried that we're edging ever closer to the precipice. And if you look at the drop in consumer confidence that we saw the past week, the stock market has lost all of its gains. That's volatile, so, it might be a slightly different situation by the time people listen to this.
Sure.
Housing starts in the U.S. We have a huge housing crisis here. Housing starts in the U.S. were the lowest that they have been since the global financial crisis.
Yeah, and we'll be talking about, coincidentally or not coincidentally, Home Depot and Lowe's both released results and had some commentary around that too.
Yes, jobless claims up. So there's a lot of signs now. This is a week, a month, whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean that's what we're going to see in March and April, right? So, but I think everybody's concerns should be growing, and my hope is just one, we'll get more clarity. But I also hope that we need to see some, just kind of tying to the themes of my book, not to pitch my book, but this is about courageous leadership.
As listeners may know, as you certainly know, I write a report for Retail Council of Canada where I get to talk to dozens and dozens of CEOs, in interviews, and I just wrapped up my first quarter report. And it's interesting because we looked at it, and this is the feedback from the people I was talking to, that there's three elements happening up here, a couple of which are similar. One is not similar, as an existential crisis for Canada that our best friend is kind of like not treating us so well, this 51st state nonsense. Right. The second one is the same concerns about the economic.
Or 11th province. Why not 11th?
Yeah, why not 11th? I mean that's it. If you wanted any indication how bad that is, like when we're criticizing Gretzky, who we expect more of, like he's a Canadian icon, but he's not standing up. He can choose his own friends, but anyway. Right. So when you're criticizing a guy, a Canadian icon like that, it's bad. The economic uncertainty here, which is very similar to the States, right? What's going on? Cycle. I got to replan. I got to reforecast. I got to do this. So that's very similar. And then the third part, which is very interesting, and it's already happening. Big retailers are reporting big changes in market share choices by Canadian consumers who are choosing Canadian products and starting to think about choosing Canadian retailers versus U.S. retailers, notwithstanding the wonderful U.S. retailers here in Canada that employ tens of hundreds of thousands of people. But it's creating this schism where Canadians are like, they've already canceled a lot of travel to the States. They've, there's all of these kind of third implications. That's real. Like, that's not stated in intent. I talked to retailers with double-digit changes in what people are doing, and it reminded us all 5 years ago, almost to the month, I wrote a report, this is February 2020, that there was this thing going on in China that people were getting sick, and retailers are saying, this may cast a shadow on the year. 5 years later.
Cast a shadow might have been.
At the time, right? I didn't know it was going to be a full eclipse, right? But at the time, it was like, this will really be bad if it comes here, right? This will be bad, we think.
Right.
But we don't know. We're in a very similar, it's very similar to me. We don't know. Like, this could be really, really bad for us. So it's
almost
a very
exactly
similar
5 years to the day, right?
To the day, right? So I'm like, oh my God, here we are again. Now the good news is, I have to say, reflecting on both your book and the conversations, is like, we're way more ready, we're way more resilient, we're way more agile thanks to the COVID experience than we were 5 years ago, and so we're in a way better shape as leaders and organizations to handle what's next. Still not helpful. So that's the perspective I heard over and over again. It's like, we're ready for it, but what is it? What are we dealing with here? Just like you're saying. All right, well, let's get into the news. It's still the heart of earnings season and kind of related to our earlier discussions in the pod and I guess our later discussions as well. We talked about housing starts. Both Home Depot and Lowe's actually posted some pretty good results, but then had some warning signals that they also gave to the market. Take us through it.
Yeah, just quickly, and so I won't get into too much of the details, but Home Depot and Lowe's both reported earnings, obviously fierce competitors, dominant in the home improvement sector. They both had their first sales increases in a while, I believe. So they've broken the string of negative comps, though both of their increases were quite modest, but positive. Now, you could look at this as signs of rebirth. But it's a little hard to say for sure because they're comparing to really easy numbers. And there are definitely, as we've talked about a bunch of times, lots of headwinds in the home market, not only what we talked about 5 minutes ago in terms of the home starts. So sometimes, at the home improvement guys, you get some things that are particular to the weather. You get some things that are particular to, for example, what's good for them but bad for the world, the rebuilding that's going on due to the hurricanes, starting with rebuilding efforts in the LA area due to the fires. So whether this is a longer term rebound, I'd be a little bit skeptical just because of all the stuff we talked about at the top of the show. But at least it is a step in the right direction. And their profitability is decent. So they've been managing, from an operating standpoint, I would say, quite well.
Even heading into 2025, consumers were still sending very strong signals, even though their confidence was fine, that they were still trading down. They were still very much value seeking. And we see some of that reflected in a great retailer who addresses that part of the market, TJX.
Yeah, TJX, parent company of TJ Maxx, HomeSense, a bunch of other brands. They had another good quarter. And they're definitely a good operator with a really solid portfolio of business models. But to your point, it's pretty easy to see that they've been benefiting from the flight to value. We just, when I've talked about over the years, and this actually came up in the talk I did last week with a bunch of retail executives, just this continued bifurcation, particularly on the value side. So TJ Maxx, about 5% sales increase, which is not amazing, particularly given their opening stores, but much better than average. And the other piece of news that I thought was interesting is they continue to open lots of stores in North America, but they're also starting to get a little bit more serious about international. So they'll be moving into Spain as well. So historically, the off-price model has been much, much stronger in U.S. and Canada, not such a big deal elsewhere, so maybe that's starting to change.
Interesting. Let's talk about Saks Global, Neiman Marcus. It's been a chaotic or dynamic week in Dallas. And you said before, you mentioned to me off mic, it's a Dallas story. How much should we talk about it? And I was thinking it really highlights, we're going to stay in downtown Dallas. We're out. We're back in. We're out. Yeah. It really highlights the emotional connection that retailers can have in a city and with people, right back to our Kevin Kelly episode. Yeah. What's the latest and what do you, how are you feeling about it? And how's the city feeling about it? And any takeaways for it?
Well, first to the specific news. Last Wednesday was kind of funny because as we talked about, the Saks store was going to close. Then I was about to head to this talk I was doing and news was, well, no, actually Saks or the Neiman store is not going to close because the holdout in the lease had reached an agreement to donate their piece of land, and that was going to allow the deal to go forward. So hallelujah, hosannas, the store is saved. Yeah. So I went into my talk saying, well, it looks like we got some good news. And then I left the talk, and on the way back was like, not so fast, because Saks now says they intend to close the store anyway. Who knows? By the time people are listening to this, maybe something else will have happened. But it's part of a broader, just continued craziness that's kind of going on at Saks. So there's this, particular story, and then there's also just continued PR troubles with what they're planning to do with paying vendors. So we talked a little bit about that last week, but I would say the PR vendor uproar continues. So we'll see how that sorts out. But to your broader point about the emotional connection to stores, as we've talked about, and it's really fundamentally at the heart of what makes for remarkable retail. Like you can be remarkable in terms of the efficiency of what you do. But of course, the most powerful brands, the Hermèses, the LVMHs, the Apples, the Abercrombie and Fitches, what really makes them special is not that they execute well. That's kind of table stakes. But when you really meet consumers' needs in a powerfully relevant, emotionally connecting way, that's really kind of the X factor. So it's not surprising that if you're a beloved brand and you close a store or you file for bankruptcy, or in many cases, obviously, brands have gone away, that can really strike a chord. So some of this is related to the emotional connection that folks have with a strong brand like Neiman Marcus. It's just exacerbated by the history of the company here in Dallas as being, many people probably listening to this don't appreciate that when the Neiman Marcus store opened and started to become famous, Dallas was really a cow town. It was, there
literally
was very little sort of good shopping, like literally Fort Worth a little bit more, but it's getting into a little bit too much local stuff. Yeah. Well, and to the extent, long. Dallas and Texas for a long time really had almost like a insecurity about, we want to be a big, important city, but we're clearly not where New York, Boston, San Francisco is. So when Neiman Marcus started to become more of a national phenomenon, started to expand, and then became the most powerful luxury retailer, arguably on the planet, but definitely in North America or the Americas, that was a source of great civic pride. And so this beautiful building in the heart of downtown has a special place in how the city and, frankly, probably North Texas and some of the region that comes to Dallas to shop at Neiman Marcus feels. So I do think it is more than just a civic story. So I think we see this played over when Marshall Field got converted to Macy's in Chicago. Yeah. That was a big deal. Dayton's in Minneapolis, Wanamaker's in Philadelphia. We can kind of go around the horn in many, not just U.S. cities, but throughout the world.
Listen, let's talk about a couple last things. Let's talk about Warby Parker. We've had Neil Blumenthal on the show, and they did a very interesting thing with Target. Talk about it briefly.
Yeah, they're going to be opening, and, we don't want to make too much of this other than it is a strategic shift for Warby Parker. They have been exclusively operating their own stores. Now they're going to do shops within a shop at Target. So initially it's only 5 stores. Don't think we know what the upside could be, but if you look at Ulta at Target, which is going to be many hundreds of stores, and given the sheer number of Targets, you could imagine this could get to be quite a big number.
Yeah.
I'm actually surprised it's taken this long for Warby Parker to do some sort of, I mean, this is not strictly wholesale in the traditional sense,
Sure.
but to go into a retail partnership because it gets them potentially a lot of locations much more quickly at a much lower cost. Target as a partner is interesting. Target's done, as many people will know, quite a few of these partnerships with the new disruptor direct-to-consumer brands, so it's not surprising from that perspective.
I like the brand fit. I mean, the forward-thinking, forward-looking optical section. I like it, right?
I think it's a good fit, and I think because Warby Parker, I don't know how many of their stores would fit this, but Warby Parker has gone into not an insignificant number of the best malls around the country. So, that would be a reason perhaps not to partner with a Macy's because you're already in the locations that you would want to be, or you're working on locations there. So this gets them a different kind of real estate strategy, gets them a lot of traffic in front of their brand. And like I say, I think it's certainly from a capital investment, it's way the heck lower. We don't know what the terms of the deal would be, but so at this point I would look at it as a test, but could be a quite interesting way for Warby to get to those 800 stores they've talked about from their current 250, 260.
Just to wrap up, I wanted to send congratulations out to great Canadian retailer David Boone, who's running Staples Canada, and he was at Loblaws. He's now the new president and CEO of Michael's, Grapevine, Texas, I believe, right? In kind of your
correct, just up the road from me.
Your neck of the woods.
I do know David a little bit.
So congratulations to David. That's a good choice. He's a great retailer. So
have to take him out for barbecue, I guess.
That's right. Good. Any excuse. All right. Well, that's it for the news brought to you by Salonis. And now let's get to our segment all about what's going on in retail stores. Well, we've teased it enough. Let's get to this segment because that
is a fair comment.
It's one of my first recollections of you and when we met was back in, I think it was 2018, 2019, and I was really fighting along with other people this whole retail apocalypse. And I guess we kind of find ourselves in some little way back to that moment or back to that time where we see we just saw like, as Joann's, right? He's just announced like 800 store closings, nothing.
Yep.
And we've got, you wanted, it's a big deal, right? So as we said, we wanted to dive into this and start unpacking it, peel this onion back. As I mentioned, we've got some data from Coresight, so we should give a shout out to Deb. But let's talk about, vis-a-vis prior year. What did you see in her data, and where do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, well, just to hit on that, thanks to Deb and her team at Coresight for sharing some of their data to just give a real, we won't go into it in any detail, but I would say Coresight has plenty of great insight on a lot of topics, but they also keep track of store closings, particularly in the U.S. and U.K. So they're a great source if that's something you're interested in. We'll put a link to Coresight in the show notes. But the reason, I guess, for this topic right now is the spike we've already seen so far in the U.S., as I mentioned in the news segment, up 400%. Now, a little bit of that, that'll smooth out because, first of all, it's not uncommon for retailers to look at their store portfolio post-holiday. And we've got big players like Macy's closing a bunch of stores, but just the 800 alone from Joann's has really contributed to that number. But I do see, as we talked about in my predictions, the closings going up a lot. We'll talk about why I think that is. Coresight's actually even more pessimistic. They think that store closings will more than double, so over 15,000. Last year was the highest number in a number of years as well. So it's quite significant. And so, yes, the idea that the retail apocalypse may be again upon us has gotten more traction, I guess, just in the last little bit here. When you look at this, kind of why this narrative, I guess, started to emerge back 5-6 years ago and why it's coming again, some of that is related to just this idea started by Mark Andreessen that physical retail is going to go away over time, largely because of the growth of e-commerce. Now, I think that particular idea is just incredibly silly, but it is the case.
Shopify said the same thing. There was a whole cast of characters who were saying, well, why would you ever go to a physical store before? Like, it was not a...
Right. And I think that just speaks to a misunderstanding of why physical retail exists. But it is the case that generally, and we've absolutely seen this over the past 2 decades, that growing e-commerce, growing online shopping will come somewhat at the expense of physical real estate, both the number of units as well as how big your stores need to be. And we've gone through, if you just look at pre-COVID, something like, just in the US, but you'd see similar numbers in a lot of other countries, e-commerce growing at 13, 14, 15% year over year, and physical retail growing more like 2 or 3%. So that's why now, depending on which measure you like, e-commerce is like 20% of all retail sales. And I think there's little question that e-commerce will continue to grow at probably 2 to 3 times the rate of physical stores. E-commerce today, even though the growth rate has slowed a lot, online shopping doubled in the US in 5 years' time. So that's very, very significant. So something has to come out of that. What I think was true when we first started talking about the retail apocalypse narrative, and what is still largely true today, is it makes certain types of real estate, physical real estate, very vulnerable. And this has been, people who follow my work for a while will know what I call the collapse of the unremarkable middle. So part of what we've seen for over a decade is this bifurcation, generally, not specific to online versus physical, but we've generally seen this bifurcation of value retail, whether it's Walmart, Amazon, Costco, dollar stores, TJ Maxx, we talked about a little bit in the news, growing at a much faster rate. And we've also seen generally pretty nice growth at the other end of the spectrum, whether that's luxury retail, which is going through some challenges right now. But if you take the long view of history here, luxury retail has grown faster than retail on average, as well as a lot of more specialty formats, whether that's Tractor Supply or it's Lululemon or Sephora, Viora. There's lots of more upscale, not necessarily luxury, but upscale focused formats that have been growing faster than most of retail. And most of those brands are physically dominant. So they're adding a lot of stores. But the model that was so successful forever until e-commerce were category killer stores, like, lots of one kind of thing all in one place across a distribution of price points. So that's Jo-Ann Fabrics. That's the Office Superstores. That's Toys R Us. That's physical bookstores, in many cases. So
Bed Bath and Beyond.
Bed Bath and Beyond. So there's lots of these formats that were very, very successful until they weren't, and that is where the internet, the internet's particularly good at having a lot of stuff all in one place, namely your phone or the computer. And if you're trying to compete with kind of the endless aisle that the internet offers in a largely price kind of commodity oriented dynamic, you are very, very vulnerable. And of course, not surprisingly, this is where we've seen, if you look at the store closings and the bankruptcies over the past decade or so, yes, you can find some companies that were very poorly managed. Yes, you can find some companies that took on too much debt. Neiman Marcus's bankruptcy had a lot to do, not with it being a bad business model, but with it being over leveraged. So yes, you can find examples of that, but the overwhelming majority of store closings and bankruptcies are concentrated in the unremarkable middle. So I guess just one other stat, and then I'll kind of move on to a little bit of, so what and now what. But, the The other part, I think, that sometimes people lose sight of is, we had this big spike in store closings right around the time frame you mentioned, right before COVID. And some of that, I think, was a little bit coincidental. Some of that was there were an unusual number of large bankruptcies, like Payless, Gymboree went out
Radio Shack,
during that time. Radio Shack, Pier 1. Yeah, so I think that was a little bit coincidental. But it is the case that the U.S. has long been overbuilt. There's been a big mismatch between supply of kind of second-tier power center, strip mall kind of retail, as well as just, what we've talked about a million times about malls. At the same time, e-commerce was growing. At the same time, interest rates were going up. So, and then right on top of that time frame, you had COVID, which put a lot of shaky retailers out of business. So that was kind of a moment in time. Then you flash forward to getting to what's going on right now. One of the things, and I know we've touched on this a couple of times in the podcast, one of the things I think that's underappreciated, actually two things that I think are underappreciated that we've talked about, so I'll make it quick. One is that the 3 best years in the history of retail occurred after COVID. The average growth rate in retail was considerably above the long-term average. Mm-hmm. And most of that had to do with COVID-related effects. Partially, people weren't going out or traveling, and so they had a lot of discretionary income. But then you layer on top of that all the government stimulus, liberal federal monetary policy. And so there was just a lot of money in the system. So this drove up all retail spending. So some of the shaky retailers got a 2 or 3 year lifeline. Well, now we're, past that basically. And you can see that in escalating credit card debt. You can see that in lowered savings. And as we spent a bunch of time at the top, we're starting to see a more shaky economic scenario. So I think all these factors conspire to say, if you're in the danger zone of bankruptcy, in the danger zone of store closings, some of this played out last year, but it's going to play out much more this year. And that is why I think we'll see a lot more store closings. But I guess the last thing I'll say, and I guess the other thing, since I said two, the second thing is this consolidation that's going on that we also talked about. When you look at growth in retail, most of that is going to 6, 7 big players and, a dozen specialty retailers. Most of retail is lucky to be flat, but many players last year had negative comp store sales. And of course, unless the economic prospects improve here a lot, many of them will experience that this year. And then you layer on top inflation, tighter labor market maybe, but any other things that are going to put pressure on margin, and that will push many over the edge as well. Now, last part of my TED Talk here is that still, when you look at all that, the reason why I would say it is hyperbolic to say it's a retail apocalypse is you have to put that against some other facts. One fact is physical retail, sales through physical stores, has been up every year since the financial crisis and is very likely to be up even in a more recessionary scenario.
That's like
this year.
15, 16 years, right? If I do my math right.
Right.
It's been a long run.
Right. So it's pretty hard to say physical retail is going away when it continues to grow, right? Like that, just the math of that, this doesn't add up. And we've been averaging, and it's actually kind of scarily consistent. If you look at the Coresight numbers, we've been averaging in the U.S. between 5,000 and 6,000 store openings every year. And so now net means we'll be down net on stores again this year, and we have been several years over the last decade. So again, it's not as if there isn't a contraction going on, but to belabor the point, again, it's very concentrated overall, and it's pretty easy to explain what's going on. But the problem is, and I'll give credit to Jason Goldberg for reminding me of a good way to think about this is what many people tend to focus on, particularly the media, are averages. And of course, very few people experience the average. But the thing that Jason said in this very good little video he put on LinkedIn last week is, if you look at Nepal, on average, Nepal is a flat country.
That's great.
Well, if you know anything about Nepal, Nepal is very much not a flat country, but it is characterized by some very high mountains, including the biggest mountain in the world, but some very deep valleys. And so I think we just have to be careful not to get too caught up on these broad brush narratives and say, well, the important thing is, well, I guess if you are in trouble, what do you need to do to get out of trouble to hopefully avoid closing stores? But, how do you think about stores as an important part of your strategy going forward? What does this mean for perhaps a different store format going forward, a different store strategy portfolio, those kinds of things?
Yeah, if we attach some names to these store closures, one of the ones that I was thinking of as I was listening to you is like the dollar stores, right? The Dollar General, like just had so many stores, big numbers. And I think of some of the pharmacy players as well. And are there any other names that come to your mind that we should probably talk about? We've talked about many over the course of time, but that you might want to highlight?
Well, it is important. I'm glad you brought up the dollar stores because it is important when you look at store openings. And this, again, is a great example of where averages can confuse the situation a little bit. So while it's true that this year probably 5,000, 5,500 stores will open, they're overwhelmingly concentrated among a few kinds of formats. And the dollar stores for years have been a big contributor to store openings. So that's cool if you happen to play in that sector, right? But it doesn't have very much to do with you if you're in a very different kind of segment, like say grocery or whatever, right? But dollar stores have also been the source of quite a lot of store closings. Some of this is just natural because of certain locations work well and then they turn out not to work so well later on, and leases come due,
neighborhoods change.
And because there was kind of this land grab mentality on the part of dollar stores, I think some of the store closings are a reflection of that. So dollar stores are very important in the overall store openings. Off price, we talked about TJ Maxx at the top, but you can see quite a lot. So because of the growth in value more broadly, both as a kind of long-term trend, given the way a lot of this has to do with economics, particularly in the U.S., the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, and inflation adding to that interest in saving money. So that obviously tends to favor certain kinds of retailers. But you're also seeing quite a lot of specialty players. Now they don't have the kind of numbers that the dollar stores do, or even that TJ Maxx might. But Warby Parker, we talked about in the news. Vuori, Sephora, Costco and Sam's Club, obviously more value, are adding dozens of stores.
I think of Aritzia too, right? They opened
Aritzia
stores in November, December. We were at a couple of them. Great stuff.
Yeah. So I think, some of this, I guess you kind of step back, and I think what's important is to say, if you've got a winning value proposition that is centered, as I often talk about, thinking in many cases, not if you're Amazon or eBay, certainly, but, often for brands, the physical store is kind of the hub of the brand experience. It's the way consumers often get into your brand, or at least they get the kind of fullest expression. It's easy to go online and order a different size, or once you know what you like, just order. But when you think about how you get engaged with the brand and what tends to develop that loyalty and remarkability, in many cases, it has to do with your physical store. So if you're that kind of brand, whether you're a brand that's been around for a while or you're one that's growing very quickly, it's not surprising. Our guest last week, Ashley from Fabletics, they're already up to 100 stores. They're investing disproportionately in physical stores. Why? Because it allows the consumer to try the product on, see the quality, put combinations together, that kind of thing. And now over time, that may make them a pretty reliable, mostly e-commerce customer. So I don't think this is terribly mysterious if you understand the broader trends that we've seen evolve over the last few years, as well as just some of the near-term dynamics. But I think the implications really are you really have to understand what's causing these broader factors. But I think more specifically, what are you trying to accomplish as a brand? Where are your vulnerabilities? What very specifically is the role of the store? So one thing we talked about off mic, I imagine some of our listeners have seen this article in the Wall Street Journal from the past week, where they were talking about how bad some physical store experience has gotten. Mm-hmm. And I would say that comports with some of my experience. But I think part of what's going on there is those individual retailers don't seem to understand very well, or at least if they understand it, they're not executing against what the store is meant to do. So one specific thing that came up in that story was the lack of inventory in some of these stores. Now, as a finance person, you might go, well, I can do whatever analysis to show that I want to get rid of certain SKUs because of the turnover or whatever is not what I want it to be. But one of the roles of a store is immediate gratification. And or it could be, I can't say that for every brand across the board, but certainly that's something that most people would understand, right? So if you go to the store because you expect to walk out with that product and the product is not there, that may not be you may have solved one problem in terms of getting your inventory productivity numbers up, but you actually you created another. And not only, this is a short-term versus a long-term thing, is if I can't count on you having my size or what you advertised, then maybe I'm not coming back.
And I won't buy my pet food anymore. We found that when I was at Zeller's Hudson's Bay with a mass merchant, is that, when we discontinued a particular line, in that case, what was it, Martha Stewart, you lost the Martha Stewart customer, but it turned out she accounted for like a big share of our pet food. And then she would buy that anywhere, right? She was just like, I don't care where I buy my pet food, but I happen to be here because of a single reason. I think that's a cousin of what you're describing.
Yeah, and I think it gets to this point, which at one level is pretty obvious, but I feel like people lose sight of it. Is what ultimately are you trying to accomplish here, right? And if you're focused on owning or getting a share, say, think about this in terms of share a wallet and net promoter score, do you really understand by major customer segments and product categories what you're aiming to do? But I think the point here is, if you don't understand the role of the stores and how it adds to your overall strategy, how does the store support your online business, right? In terms of offering buy online, pick up in store, and developing, acquiring customers.
Or new customer. You just about exactly what you're just going to say. This, Aritzia tells us it's double, it's in the fours in terms of new customer acquisition. Ashley said the same thing in terms of Fabletics, that there's another role for these stores, and it's pretty economical actually versus paying all the platforms their outrageous amounts of money. And I can win here because I'm pretty good at finding stores and running them. So that's in your mind as well, yeah?
Yeah, well, I do think, and I don't have any data, this is very intuitive or based on anecdotal information, but I do think when we look at the spike in store closings that occurred before COVID or during COVID, more stores were closed than should have closed, because I don't think retailers were as attuned to this symbiotic relationship, I guess you could say, between digital and physical. They were closing stores on the basis of four-wall profit contribution of the physical store without the broader view. I think most retailers now get that. So I don't think we're quite as vulnerable to, and I guess I would say I don't think that explains the large number of store closings we saw last year and are going to see this year. What I think is much more characteristic of what's going on now has to do with the collapse of the middle. There's nowhere to hide anymore, and economic pressures that are pushing more companies over the edge into bankruptcy or into a situation where they'll do wholesale store closing, or they'll just say, we got to really hunker down. Let's take a closer look at our store portfolio, and that will drive it. I'm still of the general view as much as I respect the Coresight folks, and of course they have a lot more access to data and spend a lot more time on this, I still like to think that barring a recession in the U.S., which I wouldn't rule out, that the number of store closings will be closer to 10,000 than the 15,000 plus that they suggest. But regardless of whether I'm closer to being right or they're closer to being right, it's a very large number. It's more than last year.
Right.
And it's certainly even in the more, I guess it's hard to say 10,000 store closings is the optimistic scenario, but it's optimistic relative to Coresight's numbers. That will still be probably at least twice the number of store openings. So it's not nothing, but we just should understand really what's driving it. And then I guess if you're a retailer, what does this mean for you? And I think what it largely means for you is use the right perspective in looking at store closings, some of the things we just talked about. But the other is get out of the middle. That's been my clarion call for close to a decade.
Sure. Yeah.
But don't think you can cost cut or store close your way to prosperity. That is very rarely going to be a winning strategy.
One of the things I really liked about Leaders Leap is at the end of each chapter, you provided questions for the reader to ask themselves or to ask their colleagues. And what questions would you say should be asked around the table for folks who are leading retailers, are listening to our podcast, and as they think about their stores and how big the fleet is or what the role is? What are the kind of key questions they should be asking each other or asking themselves?
Well, this is a little bit off your question, but I would say a big gap in getting closer to the right answers is, do they have enough customer insight? Do they really know why they're not acquiring, if it's a troubled retailer or they're looking at some difficult situations in their portfolio, do they understand why their core customer segments are not being acquired at the rate they need, are not shopping as frequently as they should, are not cross-shopping, are not giving you high net promoter scores? When you start to understand that better, it's a lot easier to get pointed to the potential solutions. And I find a lot of retailers really lack that level of understanding. So they're kind of sometimes working on the wrong problem. But for sure, I think more specifically, if a store is not performing, is it a function of bad location? Is it a function of a weak business model? Is it a function of perhaps some episodic situations? So some things are really easy to understand. They're tearing up the highway in front of us, and right, that kind of stuff. But really, and this gets back to what I've said a million times of the problem of the slightly better version of mediocre is you can spend a lot of time on incremental improvements on the hope it's going to work, and it doesn't cause you to spend enough time on, we really have bigger issues. So certainly if you look at, just to go to one of our common areas of conversation, if you look at why Macy's stores are closing or Kohl's stores are closing, that has a lot more to do, like overwhelmingly has to do with a weak business model. And so you can close stores and get to a more manageable core, which is probably a good strategy given how they've gotten themselves into such trouble at this point. I mean, it would have been better.
What do you say? Bailing doesn't fix the hole, right? Basically.
Yeah, bailing, right. And so, I mean, it's such a cliche to say that, like, it's stunning to me when I see some of the store productivity numbers. Like, we've gotten some access to some of the JCPenney stores, and these are stores, that do $90 a square foot. Like, it's impossible to make money or maintain a decent looking store if you're working with $90 a square foot. I don't care who you are. So yes, you can close those stores and get your averages to go up. But what's the reason why your productivity is so bad? And that usually has to do with relevance, competitive position, those kinds of things. So just make sure you're working on the right problem and don't kid yourself or just say, well, things are tough in the industry, and you can't ignore the macro factors. You can't. Weather. And right. Bad weather. Right. But the weather eventually sort of evens itself out. For every cold winter we have a warm winter the next one. Like, you can't.
So it seems. Well, it's a topic we've talked about throughout the history of our pod, and I'm sure it will continue to occupy us, particularly this year, as we kind of watch and we see where these numbers shake out and what the ramifications are. But one thing for sure is we continue to find and explore and visit remarkable retail. We're going to continue to talk to people who are doing these things. And, we'll continue to have a lot of guests on the show that will help us think through all these challenges and give everyone examples of people who are doing remarkable things. So for that,
you can run, but you can't hide.
All right, let's leave it there. Thanks for tuning in. If you liked our episode, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts.
And I'm Steve Dennis, strategic advisor, keynote speaker, and best-selling author of 2 books, Leader's Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, and Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant and advisor, keynote speaker, and media entrepreneur. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.